I'm hardly an expert in this field.
That's going to become very obvious shortly.
But as a proud member of the guy with an opinion race, I feel a duty to throw my opinion at you. I also want to probe the ideology, and ask these silly anarchists some questions that seem difficult, though they've probably heard them 100 times before.
Well, I have heard them many times before. I don't want to assume that you've heard the answer to them, so I'm going to try to be as clear as possible in regards to clearing up the misconceptions you have.
Before I get into the really meaty arguments here, there's something that needs to be covered. Remember that time there was a successful anarchist society? No, me neither. But funnily enough, that's actually a disadvantage for us. You see, if I pose statism as a good idea, an anarchist can easily point out the issues with current states, like the US government, as corrupted as the water it pumps into Flint, and as shady and heartless to some as Guantanamo Bay demonstrates. But when arguing against anarchism, there's barely anything resembling a real-world example to throw back at them.
And this is where the beginning of your misconceptions begin. And I'm a bit surprised because it seems like you don't even know what anarcho-capitalism is. Anarcho-capitalism is the political philosophy that advocates for the end of institutions that systemize aggression, aka the state. What this means is that any law that aggresses rather than defends individuals should be scrapped. So when you start this argument that Ancaps have an upper hand because there are no real-world examples, there are plenty. Because we don't need a real-world example of a society completely free of aggression, because there are many examples of using voluntary interaction as opposed to coercive action in our societies and daily lives today. And voluntary interaction is really the crux of what we're striving for.
Inevitably, if you try to make something real, it's going to have issues more so than it does in concept. But anarchism, in the way that they expect, only really exists in concept, so that's all we can argue against. It ends up being an unbalanced conversation where the opponent is arguing from ideal hypotheticals, and we have to defend the worst implementations of our preference. So when I discuss anarchism versus statism, I will only discuss concept versus concept.
Okay, so you're just going to be discussing the concepts of anarcho-capitalism versus statism. So we won't even go into specifics of all the what-ifs and speculations. That's fine with me, and I think it's actually a better starting point to determine what is better.
I will not defend every fucked up action by every fucked up state there's ever been, and it's for exactly this reason that I don't expect anarchists to defend examples of anarchism in reality.
Okay, but didn't you just say that there weren't examples of anarchy in reality anyways? Well, whatever, let's move on. I'm just glad that we can try to stick to principles of anarchy versus statism first.
For example,
we're out to see the wizard, a wonderful wizard of
Somalia.
Wait, but didn't you just say you were just gonna stick to the principles of Ancaps and status and not mention what you would consider examples of anarchy, which earlier you said were non-existent?
Somalia, otherwise known as anarchist utopia, is a failed state at the Horn of Africa. My question is, how could an anarchist society be any different from that? In such a society, is it possible for there to be any variance that's not dependent simply on environment?
So is this one of those questions regarding principles that you were going to focus on asking? Because it actually seems more like one of those questions of speculation you said you wouldn't ask. Either way, I'll play ball. When you mention the great example of anarchy that is Somalia, I can see that you have little understanding of what anarcho-capitalism is, or for that matter, Somalia as well. Since 1960, when it achieved independence, Somalia was headed by the Somali Revolutionary Socialist Party, which in a matter of a couple of decades became what most countries that implement authoritarian Marxist policies become, which is a country suffering from major food and fuel shortages. Think Venezuela at present. So since people weren't too happy about not having food, a civil war erupted, and in 1991, with outside governments helping, the military dictatorship ended and the central government was dissolved. To be clear, there was still very much a presence of local government, but I think it is interesting to note a study done on the effects of post-91 Somalia. Peter Leeson of George Mason University published a study in the Journal of Comparative Economics, and by examining a number of societal development indicators from post-91, including per capita GDP, literacy rates, and more, he put forth a compelling argument that Somalia was better off without the central government it had. But back to your misunderstanding of anarcho-capitalism and its relation to Somalia. Remember my definition of the state I mentioned earlier, which was an institution that systemized aggression? Let's ask ourselves, did post-91 Somalia have institutions that systemized aggression? The answer is a clear yes. While markets freed up, which encouraged more competition and helped promote modest economic growth, there was still a system of aggression by local and competing institutions. Not only that, but you're about 4 years too late even in that classification, as Somalia has had a central government since August 2012. So you're not correct about Somalia's status as an anarchist society then or now, at least not when you're trying to refer to the political philosophy of anarcho-capitalism. But let's get back to your question, which was how can an anarchist society turn out any different from the non-anarchist Somalia? Well, I believe there are numerous possibilities as far as what could happen with other societies. Since a place like the United States was founded on very libertarian principles, unlike the socialist Somalia, a transition of gradually repealing authoritarian laws could possibly leave the country better off. And considering the demographics, economies, infrastructure, and cultural values are much different, I don't have a hard time seeing a different end result in other countries who steer away from authoritarianism. Now, this is just speculation, although I don't think I can be knocked for that considering the question asks for it.
If we're assuming the establishment of a system with no general hierarchy, which I would have thought would be necessary for anarchism,
having no hierarchy is actually not necessary for anarcho-capitalism, as long as the hierarchy is mutually consented upon by both parties. To get a good example of an Ancap structure, I'd recommend taking a look into Liberland. Liberland is a country recently founded on the borders of Croatia and Serbia, and it has a hierarchy with the president, vice president, and more. I'd recommend looking into their constitution to give you a good idea of what an Ancap society would be based on.
then how do we get capitalism, as anarcho-capitalism requires, as opposed to, say, communism, or one or more of any other number of structures or ideologies which could arise? Isn't anarcho-capitalism therefore just a statement of what you hope would happen in an anarchist system? Aren't you just rolling the dice with your anarcho-capitalist utopia as one vaguely possible outcome, and an outcome like Somalia as another possibility? Go now, Amos. Utopia's waiting for you.
I've already touched on Somalia, but when it comes to whether or not capitalism or communism would spring up in anarchism, that's not really how it would work. Anarchy is not some void where the type of economy is independent of anarchy itself. Free market capitalism is necessary to anarchy, and there wouldn't be anarchy without capitalism.
So guys, I've got some bad news. You're being robbed. Time to call the police, I think. Oh, but just one thing. Unfortunately, it's the police who are robbing you. Yes, that's right. The police, as employees of the state, are effectively stealing your hard-earned cash in the form of taxation. This is what Ancaps actually believe. Taxation is theft is one of their favourite arguments. So, let's delve into this, shall we? First point, just quickly. This argument is nothing more than a semantic equivocation, the assertion that one thing fits the definition of another thing. Now that doesn't necessarily make it a bad argument. If you can demonstrate that one thing matches the definition of something that we agree is bad, then you at least imply that that thing is bad. One major problem with this is that if that thing you're trying to equivocate with something bad is itself actually good, then all you've demonstrated is that sometimes that bad thing can be good, or can at least be done for justifiable reasons. This is the case for those who argue in favour of taxation. So Ancaps, when you're arguing against statists, and you make this point, you aren't actually arguing that taxation is bad. All you're arguing is that theft is not always bad.
It seems you're making the argument that even if it is theft, that just means that theft can be good, but you're wrong. Now, I'm not doubting that events resulting from theft can be beneficial for the recipient, but how would that somehow justify the theft itself? For example, I go and steal your cone-shaped hat and give it to someone who needed one. The only thing that would be proven was that the recipient needed the hat and that need was satisfied, but it has no bearing on the morality of the acquisition of that hat, when there could have been other ways of getting that person a hat.
And that's even assuming that we permit your argument that taxation is theft. So, is taxation actually theft? I think I can definitively say no. Here goes. Taxation is deducted from a person's income via their employment or self-employment. Being employed is not mandatory, and it is common knowledge that being employed will result in taxes being deducted from your income. By this logic, taxation is effectively consensual to anyone who works.
So your argument runs like this. Number 1, taxes are deducted from a person via their employment. Number 2, it is known that taxes will be deducted from a person's income. Number 3, employment is voluntary. Number 4, therefore taxation is voluntary. This argument fails for a number of reasons. First, the breadth of taxation is not limited to a deduction of people's incomes as described in premise 1. There's the estate tax, gift tax, sales tax, and many more that in itself don't have any direct bearing on whether the party is employed. So premise 1 fails unless you are specifically talking about the income tax. Logically, your conclusion would fail from this, but let's focus on just the income tax itself. Just because a person gets into a voluntary agreement with their employer does not mean that the tax itself would be voluntary. Since this work agreement would be a contract, the agreed upon dictated terms would be voluntary on the condition that the employer is voluntarily dictating those terms, but that's not the case. An employer is being forced to have the income tax as a term of their employee's employment, and thus is not voluntary for either party, thus making it theft. But it's just a theft that you're willing to give a pass for, and I'm sure you realize the accountability problem when it comes to spending stolen money.
Obviously, it is a condition of all forms of work, so it may seem like this distinction is practically irrelevant, but we can actually solve this problem with some capitalistic logic. Your state is not the only state, so if you don't like it, be a discerning consumer and go to a different one.
And this is the common, if you don't like it, then leave it response. And what this response does is try to avoid morality. In the 1700s, people would tell the abolitionists, if you don't like slavery, then leave. In the 1900s, they would tell anti-prohibitionists, if you don't like prohibition, then leave. The people trying to maintain a moral and free society shouldn't have to leave because others want to continue their system of aggression. And now I'm gonna skip a bit to one last point made.
So, as I'm sure you know, the people are being oppressed by an arbitrary social hierarchy consisting of the oppressor class and the oppressed masses, who are systematically and systemically disadvantaged by the oppressor class. The people need to rise up and liberate themselves from this oppression, overthrowing the ruling elite and forming into a society without arbitrary stratification, where everyone can be, in a sense, equal. Who am I? If you said a Marxist, you're right. If you said an anarcho-capitalist, you're also right. But if you said a liberal, conservative, or anything like that, you're wrong. But guys, seriously, Ancaps aren't Marxists, guys.
Man, it's funny how in the full video you chastise Anarchy Ball for making a reductionist argument, in a meme I might add, but then you make this reductionist strawman comparison. We are not saying there needs to be an overthrow of a class that fits into some sort of dichotomy. We are advocating for individual freedoms, meaning I can't steal from you now and couldn't even if I got a majority on my side who agreed I could, which is actually antithetical to the collectivist ideas of Marxism. So I hope you take this criticism in good faith, and I'd recommend learning a bit more about what anarcho-capitalism actually consists of as an ideology. Some good resources are the Mises Institute and fee.org to get some more answers to specific questions. But otherwise, I hope this was helpful. There'll be links in the descriptions below. Liberty out, but not gone.